All right. We will be joined by our guest shortly, but until then, let's talk about the libertarianinstitute.org/donate. Go donate your money to us to keep us rolling. If you send any amount of donation to the libertarianinstitute.org at this moment, it will be doubled. It will be matched by another donation. So, therefore, go and double your money with the libertarianinstitute.org/donate. Keep the site up and running, keep the podcasters podcasting, keep the writers writing, and the books flowing at the libertarianinstitute.org/donate. Give us your money. And out, out. As y'all know, I quit smoking almost a year ago. And I have developed a new fascination with nicotine through nicotine pouches. And Alp is the best one out there. Alp offers 3 or 4 different flavors. I choose the wintergreen. I like the wintergreen. I'm out right now. It's at the post office. I'm waiting on them to open so I can go get more Alp and have my Alp pouches. Until then, I am using some yucky other brand, but go get your Alp today and using the link in the description below, get 10% off. And if you purchase $70 or more, it's free shipping. So go get your Alp. It's the best way to ingest nicotine. So, Alp, pouches, nicotine, yummy. Link in the description, 10% off, $70 or more, get free shipping. That's 5 rolls per log, 5 cans per log, 3 logs, $70, free shipping every month, automatically sent to you. Like I said, mine's at the post office. I just can't get to it yet because they're not open. But go check the link in the description, get your 10% off, get your Alp, and enjoy the nicotine. It is the best way to ingest nicotine that I've found, and it tastes so damn good. I can't wait to get mine later on today. All right, I'm here with Mr. Bill Buppert from the Chasing Ghosts podcast. What's going on, buddy?
Hey, how are you?
I'm
Well,
doing well.
I'm honored by you having me on, Tommy. Thank you.
Yeah, no doubt, man. I really enjoy your podcast. We were just talking about kind of your style before we jumped on here. So give the audience a background of who you are, where you come from, and what it is that you're trying to accomplish with your podcast.
Okay, so I want everybody to know that Tommy is my colleague at the Libertarian Institute, where I'm the Smedley D. Butler Fellow for Military Affairs, working for Scott Horton. I spent almost a quarter century in uniform as both an enlisted guy and an officer. I retired, took 4 years to get the let out, started contracting. That culminated in more time overseas because I've been a combat tourist in various neo-imperialist shit pits planet-wide. And in this case, I spent 2 years out of uniform in Afghanistan and managed to wrangle a job in my last year in Afghanistan, staying here in Conus, which has been wonderful. So my specialty, I would say, is irregular warfare. Irregular warfare, as an umbrella rubric, is everything that isn't conventional. So that would be guerrilla warfare, counter guerrilla, insurgency, counterinsurgency, hybrid, gray zone, information warfare, all of those things that aren't the toe to toe conflict modalities that one would see portrayed in Hollywood and things like that. I've spent time in light infantry, airborne, air assault, and special forces formations. And I started chasing ghosts because I saw not necessarily a market opportunity where I could make money, but no one was talking about counterinsurgency, insurgency, and of course, this is at the height of our, well, after the nadir of our encounters in Afghanistan, Iraq, and all over the place, and just the patent failures of America's ability to win counterinsurgency. And I would extend that to the West. It is my suggestion and conceit that the West, the US and the West, have no capacity whatsoever to win a counterinsurgency fight for a lot of reasons that are probably much too long for me to go over than the brief time you and I are going to spend together, Tommy. And then what happened is when we had the regime change in Mordor on the Potomac, I saw an opportunity, maybe, just maybe, where the DoD could fix itself. And I don't think it could ever fix itself to be better at going overseas because I don't want that. I want it to fix itself to start defending the homeland. So I started an accompanying podcast called War Notes. And in War Notes, I, I address conventional warfare. I address, because I'm expert in both, and I'm a military historian, and I am also a conflict futurist. So both of these podcasts have given me the opportunity to speak to what that's all about. And in War Notes, I spent, I think, almost a dozen. Yeah,
We lost sound. Uh-oh.
do you
There
have
we
me?
go. Yes, sir.
Okay.
Okay. Okay.
You can edit. Okay. Okay. Sorry about that.
No, you're good.
So, so there it is. I mean, and then of course I got hired on by Scott
Mm.
to blog, and I blog probably two, three, five times a week on the various failures and cavalcades of calamities. That
Yes,
is the
sir.
American DoD and its exquisite platform. So here I am.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So I one of the things that I heard someone talking about a while back, this was before the Israel war in Gaza, is they were saying that the West doesn't have the gumption, the brutality to defeat these insurgents in places like Afghanistan. It's kind of almost like this the morality of Western war fighting has kind of decapitated their ability to really do what's necessary to accomplish their goals. Do you see that as being true?
Tommy, I see that as patently false. What I see is that when you can ask the 3 million corpses in Vietnam, and you can ask all the women and children who have been maimed and killed in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, the Horn of Africa, going back to Haiti, going back to Serbia, going back to all the less than full-on conventional warfare engagements the U.S. has conducted since 1945. But then again, we could go all the way back to 1609. Then we can fast forward to 1775. Then we can fast forward to 1783. And then you have a continuation of the Aboriginal wars that were waged. Those were not done by Marcus and Queensberry rules. Those were not observant of the soon to come in the 20th century Hague and Geneva Conventions. I mean, if you look at World War II history, for instance, which I like to call the war to save Joseph Stalin, what you discover is that the Dresden bombings, the bombings that were authored against cities, first not by the Germans, not by the Japanese, but by the British. I mean, the British gave us concentration camps at the turn of the 20th century. It was at the end of the 19th century and the turn of the 20th century that Americans were employing their original gangster usage of waterboarding, in which 1/3 of those waterboarded would die during the process. So I think this idea of taking the gloves off, that's narrative triumphalist thinking by people who are trying to justify all the losses at the tactical and strategic level that have taken place. And I'm very fond of saying that. Are you familiar with anti-fragility and fragility?
No.
So Nassim Taleb is a speculator, and he's written several books, one of which was Black Swan, another one called Anti-Fragility. And
Mm.
this is all it's about, to put it in the simplest terms possible. We're all familiar with seeing movies or maybe old black and white video film of the massive radar sets that you had in the Antarctic and the Arctic that were subject to winds that were very severe. So they put domes around them. We've all seen those domes, those Buckminster Fuller style domes. What that dome does is every time excuse me, a microburst or a large wind burst hits that, at the one point or part of that dome that it hits, it instantly distributes that load around the entire dome to reduce it so it doesn't blow it away. That's what happens. In other words, it is a modality that strengthens under stress.
Mm.
So when you're anti fragile, you are strengthened under stress. When you are fragile, large bureaucratic entities, whether that be the government or an army at war that's gone overseas to invade a country, they don't deal with stress too well when it comes to things like that. But when it comes to insurgencies where folks are fighting on their own turf, and whether that insurgency is a result of being in a regional conflict complex that has started to devolve into itself into separate wars, or it happens to be where they want to take over the government in its entirety, or it happens to be that they want to liberate a part of that country and make it their own, they're very anti-fragile. They're fighting on their own turf. And when it comes to Muslim religionists, and then you can go before the 8th century, when it comes to the, not the Arab religion, but the Arab ethnicities and the way they fight, these people have been fighting the way they do for thousands of years. Arabs, for instance, are terrible at fighting conventional conflict. I would direct anybody who wants to find out why that is. I'm not going to bore you with it right now. Kenneth Pollock's book, Armies of Sand. That's go there and you'll find out why Arab armies can't fight conventionally. But Arab armies, Muslim armies, can fight very well unconventionally. Whether it's T.E. Lawrence, I think some of us have seen that film. It's my favorite film of all time, Lawrence of Arabia from 1962. A gorgeous film. Took some artistic license with history nonetheless, but interesting to see it. When you see the way they fight as mobile guerrillas, they're taking on the fight the way all of our foes have taken on the fight. You can also say this about the American Aboriginals going back to the 17th century in America. They've taken the fight so that they will fight until they're starting to lose and they fade away. And then that means they can maintain their fighting strength. And what they're doing is they're winnowing away at the strength of the invader. And in this case, and you had sort of alluded to this earlier, the more women and children that you kill in a country that you've invaded, maim or kill, all you're doing is increasing the ranks and strengthening the spine of resistance. People, for instance, I spent almost 2 years of my life in Afghanistan. And there's several things. I could spend hours telling you what I learned over there that speaks to why we don't do those kind of things well. But one of them is this: Afghanistan outside of Kabul, and you'll appreciate this as a fellow Austrian, doesn't exist as a country. They don't recognize that. I was bemused when I was over there, and somebody was saying, "Yeah, every time Kabul sends out tax collectors, only half of them come back." And they didn't see the wry smile on my face at the time when they said that. but these are countries that know who they are about. I I I know this sounds like braggadocio when I say this, but Buppert's law of military topography is that a culture of riflemen who know what they're about in mountainous terrain cannot be militarily defeated. And I think that stands forth certainly in Afghanistan. When you look at Afghanistan as a fight, we were told in America, well, we're fighting the Taliban. No, you're not. You are, but you're not only fighting them. You're fighting hundreds of resistance organizations that are united by clan, feud, family, and blood. And they've been doing it for hundreds of years. They kicked the British out twice. They kicked the Russians out once, and they've kicked the U.S. out once.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So when you look at what's going on with the Houthis in Yemen, how do you see that? Because I'm trying to figure out, like, okay, if
Yeah.
the Houthis are intentionally attacking U.S. cargo ships, you can't allow it. You got to figure out a way to bring it to a head. But I'm not sure that militarily is the right way to do it. How do you foresee this going over there? Because it doesn't
So
seem like, as small as the country of Yemen is, as poorly funded as the Houthis are, they continue they don't ever seem to run out of people.
nor do they run out of munitions. So
Right.
again, and I know you probably think that I'm being a bit of a cad when I do this, but for me, history informs everything we do today. And
Mm,
if you don't know where you've been, you can't possibly know where you are. If
mm,
you take a look at a map of Yemen, you see that the Houthi control the western third of that country, which happens to be contiguous to the Red Sea, and
mm.
that little tiny channel there that's about 14 miles across. That is very mountainous terrain. Like you've probably heard, Tommy, where folks are saying, well, we need to invade Iran and we'll take care of the mullahs and stuff like that. Take a look at a map.
That's
There's
a
a lot of
bad.
mountains.
That's yeah. That's not the strategy I want to hear.
You do not want to do that. So, and the Houthis are doing what they're doing for a variety of reasons. I think that some of them may be mercenary, but one of them is because our friend Barack Obama sponsored a war in Yemen
Hmm.
by giving the green light to the Saudis and their co-belligerents to go in there and take care of the Houthi because there was a civil war going on at the southern reaches of the Saudi Arabian border. They didn't like it. They wanted to have some kind of influence down there, and they started a war that they didn't have the cash to pay the checks with when they did. The
Hmm.
Saudis are just if it weren't for instance, I've spent time in Saudi Arabia, and I know this sounds like a broad statement, but I do think it's accurate. Remove all the Filipinos and remove all the Pakistanis from Saudi Arabia, it would collapse in 24 hours
Really?
because they don't work. Nor, having worked with their military, nor does their Arab army work for a lot of reasons that are probably conversant with why Arab armies don't work, but in this case, you have a country called Saudi Arabia, which means that it was formed by the House of Saud. It's like calling imagine Bush Arabia
Mm.
or Tommy Arabia or Bill Arabia, whatever the fact may be. That house is what formed it, and it also informs the way it does things. And because of their oil wealth, they have become incredibly lazy in everything that they do. And war making, when you attach that laziness to the fact that Arab conventional armies just don't work out that well. For me, I don't always have an answer to these conflicts because as an engineer, one thing that I know, Tommy, is that if a problem can't be solved, if it's insoluble, it's not a problem. It's something you got to live with.
Mm.
So in this case, what have we done to cause the Houthis to behave in the fashion that they do? Well, we have funded and abetted and assisted and provided military materiel and training to the Saudis who invaded their country and took them on. Maybe if we brought the Saudis and the Houthis, along with the other co belligerents within Yemen proper, to the negotiating table, what's wrong with talking? What's wrong with trying to work this out? This is the same beef that I have with the special military operation by the Russians into the Ukraine. What's wrong with talking? Boris Johnson has torpedoed and hijacked all the opportunities to talk. I call the EU the EU SSR. They have done
Mm.
everything they possibly can, to torpedo peace talks. What is wrong with the U.S. State Department or its their colleagues in NATO or the EU SSR going to Switzerland, getting a very expensive top floor of a building, getting very expensive teak furniture and all the most exquisite refreshments you can have, bring in expert diplomats and folks who do that for a living, and sit there and just twiddle your thumbs and tender an invitation to all belligerents to come there and talk. There is nothing wrong with talking. It could lead to resolution, could lead to nothing, but why not do it? For instance, 1938, we have the appeasement speech with when the Germans go into Slovakia and take it over, and it's the Anschluss, and of course the UK sends their prime minister over there, and he says, "Hey," he comes back and says, "We have peace in our time." Well, yeah, that failed, but it doesn't mean just because that one instance. And by the way, we could talk for hours concerning World War II and that triumphalist history. It doesn't mean that the capacity to make diplomacy and talking work is exhausted by any means, by any stretch, in any conflict you're involved in.
So yeah,
That was a
and
long answer. I apologize, Tommy.
no, you're fine. I just wanted to make sure
Yeah.
you were
Yeah.
done. One of the things I think happens is that people look at these organizations like the Houthis or Al Qaeda, these terrorist organizations, and they think that they're below bringing to the table, and that you shouldn't appease them in any way, shape, or form. Unfortunately, a lot of people forget the history of the ANC in South Africa and that it started off as a terrorist organization and then worked its way into a political organization. And so a lot of the times what you're looking at with these terrorist organizations, they're actually attempting to be as brutal as possible in order to get a seat at the table. And so people think that it's kind of below our standards to sit and talk with them and that you're legitimizing them in this fashion.
So as a genuine Afrikaans American with Boer blood from my ancestors, I am I probably have a very different viewpoint about the ANC and about Nelson Mandela and what's happened to that country. And I just think it's a disaster, but it doesn't mean that I wouldn't want to speak to them across the table.
Right.
But then again, you look at the IRA and all of its splinter groups and variants
Mm.
since, and it came in three phases. You had 1918 to 1922, where all of a sudden, after an 800-year occupation, the Irish Republican Brotherhood, which was the ancestor to the IRA, which formed after 1922, Ireland, the island of Ayr, gets its own province and counties below what is Northern Ireland today. They're their own independent country. And then you go to World War II, and then you find that after World War II, the entire IRA and all the splinter groups, almost without exception, become Marxist Leninist organizations. If you look at Sinn Féin today, by the way, Tommy, you caused this yourself because you brought it up. But if you look at Sinn Féin's behavior today in Ireland, whether it's Northern Ireland, which is still in the United Kingdom, or the Independent Republic of Ireland, due south of North Ireland, they're the wokest, most communistic, most government supremacist organs you will ever see. And it's just it's sort of a letdown because for the most part, Caleb Carr he would characterize terrorism as politically motivated violence against non-combatants, if we wanted to put it simply.
Mm.
Now, there's going to be permutations to that and things like that. Are there times when that kind of violence is employed and then a legitimate government emerges from it? That may be the case, but I've just described Ireland. I don't think it's led to good outcomes. When I look at South Africa today, which is in the news today because you have a government in South Africa that has the ANC stamp broad and deep, they are
Hmm.
calling not only for the unfinanced and unrecompensed confiscation of land by whites, but they fill stadiums calling for the annihilation and murder of whites.
Right.
And then you have Israel, which is born, and I would tell everybody within earshot of this podcast that you should listen to Martyr Made, Daryl Cooper's Martyr Made podcast on fear and loathing in the New Jerusalem, where he takes up the formation of Israel by the Jews and the Zionists from the end of the 19th century until approximately 1948 when it is formed. And he gives a pretty dispassionate and I don't like to use the term unbiased because I don't think there's any such thing as unbiased. There is to a certain extent in science and engineering. As an engineer, I happen to be in the kind of science in which all of our mistakes are out there for everybody to see when we make them. You know, most academic or abstract science isn't that way, but he talks about something from 47 to 48, I think it's 46 to 48. The Arabs remember this, and it's called the Nakba, which means in Arabic, the catastrophe. It is where men, women, and children of Arab extraction, if they didn't obey at the time Zionist and then Israeli demands to leave, would be decimated, injured, killed, whatever the case may be. Awful. Men, women, and children.
Hmm.
Now, I'm not justifying their reaction to what happened during the Nakba for the behavior. For instance, I did a 5 episode series on October 7th, 2023, with
Hmm.
the invasion of Israel by Gaza and what happened in the aftermath. And my proposition is that when you look at that, that could very well happen here tomorrow morning.
Hmm.
Gunned up, more personnel. To make the math easy, let's say that there are 10,000 sleepers or Islamists here that on a Monday or Tuesday morning would be activated with a phone call, and you've got 1,000 cells of 10 men. They're
Hmm.
all armed, equipped, trained, and you don't need a lot of training to do what they're going to do because, and I owe a lot to Kurt Schlichter's book, The Attack, and Deuce Ray, Day of Wrath by William Fortune, where they both use those books to novelistically illustrate what that attack would look like. So I drew from that and I added some of my own ideas and speculation of what that would look like. But the worst part of that happening is the very real possibility that they don't have to be directed. Once these 1,000 cells are loosed, they have very simple directions,
Hmm.
which is you maim and kill and injure and destroy as much infrastructure and material as you can until you are no longer able to or dead.
Yeah, I was listening to the Sean Ryan show the other day, and he
Okay.
had
Yeah.
he had a couple of
Sarah.
intelligence officers on there. Well, there
Yeah.
were three different ones
Okay.
that were on there
Yeah.
on this last episode,
Okay.
and he was talking about this exact thing. And he said a team of like 10 uh, within of these terrorists could like tie up like 20, 30,000 people for hours, and there's
Hours
not and we're not prepared to deal with.
in the least.
Yeah, like
Yeah.
even a SWAT team is trained to deal with one person. They're not trained to deal with 10 people. So
Yeah.
he said it would be just catastrophe if something like this were to take off.
The wild card in America, and you may know this already, Tommy, because from listening to your podcast, I know that you are widely read and you listen. Is the wild card in America is the atomistic access to weapons that we have. I live in the state of Florida, for instance. I carry all the time. I carry wherever. I even carry in my house. So, of course, when we're traveling, I have
Hmm.
something available to me, and we have that kind of access, unless you're in a state like Calizuela or the Soviet Northeast in America, and then maybe you don't have access like that. But did you know that in Israel, less than 2% of the population carries firearms outside of their reserve duties? They are authorized to have one, and they can fire 50 rounds a year to maintain their quality of excellence with their firearms each year.
Really?
So that's why, yeah. So that's why what you had, and of course, if you think about it, Likud is left of center, and Labor is left of left. And here's a pop quiz for you, Tommy. You may know the answer to this. What was the first country to recognize Israel's existence and declare them a country?
Wasn't it Germany?
It was the USSR.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and why would they do that? Because it is a communist enterprise. If you take a vacation in a kibbutzim and see what it looks like, you know,
Hmm.
in a kibbutz, and so that it Israel has always been a very curious manifestation of an almost working communist enterprise. But you will notice that they need a lot of influx of dollars. They probably have one of the most sophisticated espionage networks around the world with both active agents and then I guess asking their diaspora members around the world to put their shoulder to the wheel and do what they can for the mother country and things like that. But here's another pop quiz for you. When we're talking about Israel, what percentage of the land in Israel is owned by the Israeli government?
I don't think any of it is, or very,
94%.
very.
94%.
Oh, really? Oh, okay. So you're saying that they actually took like property rights over the land they stole. Let's see, I was thinking that it was still owned by the Palestinians and they were just controlling it through
No,
force.
they lease it out to citizens. Now, there's a practical reason for that. Number
Okay.
one is if they didn't, then the the UAE and the Saudis would have a lot of money where they would purchase Israeli land.
Mm.
And I see that. But the other aspect is more
Oh.
philosophical in that they're very communist oriented in the way they do things.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and that is something that's really interesting when you look at like the birth of communism, especially in Eastern Europe. It was a lot of Jewish people that were actually pushing that onto the country, and it's just really strange that they're so like directed in that way. I wonder where
It
that. Do
is.
you know where that comes from, like
I
historically?
I don't, and that is a dangerous path for us to take rhetorically because it never profits anybody who discusses it
Mm,
along with some other things. So I tend not to. But then I look. I'm an Austrian economist, Tommy, and I
hmm
think that you're one could say you're an Austrian economist too because I know what you read. And if you look at von Mises, if you look at Hayek, if you look at Baron Baruch, if you look at Murray Rothbard, I mean, you look at all of these luminaries. What do they happen to be? They happen to share the same Jewish blood that I have a bit of. So,
hmm
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, it's just one of those things that's really interesting. I think I was talking to Scott about it a while back about like World War II and Hitler's distaste for the Jewish people, and it seemed like a lot of it came from the anti-communist kind of view in his mind, and it just kind of distorted into this weird like like ideology that he eventually came up with, and it was like, okay, if
Yeah,
that's
and
the
when
way you want to take it, I
and
guess.
you know and it brings up a great point tangentially here, where here we are, we look around and we see people who are calling Tesla a Nazi and things like that. They're calling
Mm,
him a national socialist. They're calling him a fascist. But what you find is, I've sort of solved this problem with labeling. I use the term government supremacist as an umbrella term under which is fascism, communism, national socialism, socialism, you name it. Whatever involves the state and the collective instead of the individual, I will refer to it as government supremacist. And when you employ that framing, what you discover is that those who are calling Tesla a Nazi haven't studied history.
mm, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and you have to wonder if like the fire bombings and all these things that are going on at these Tesla dealerships aren't brought down from somebody with money and
Oh,
financed.
I absolutely think they are. And the tragedy of this too is that the cars that are being vandalized are privately owned.
Mm,
The dealerships that are being vandalized, Tesla's already got his money from both of these parties, whether it's the dealership that purchased the vehicles to sell or the folks who went to the dealership to purchase them to drive. Tesla's got his money already. They're not harming him, they're harming individuals.
yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's attacking a symbol.
Yeah.
And that's the way they
Yeah.
look at it. It's making a political statement um, in the process. I noticed that the guy that they caught that guy who had keyed that car because Teslas
Yeah.
have like 50 cameras on them, and you're not going to vandalize it without being recognized in some way,
Yeah.
shape, or form.
Yeah.
And so they caught the guy who keyed the car. They charged him with a felony. And
I
so
saw that.
I mean,
And I'm glad.
just for keying a car, he's looking at 20 years. And so you got to be very careful whenever attacking these symbols that you are putting yourself in a position to where you're going to be the victor. Otherwise, that
Absolutely.
you're going to pay the price.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, um, do you think that what we're seeing here locally is going to amplify that we see any more violence that it becomes more like a Summer of Floyd type situation?
I absolutely see that. And I see that there's been some data mongers out there. And on Twitter, Data Republican has done some great stuff for Doge. But there was another, it might have been Mike Benz, who demonstrated that over 80% of the folks that we're seeing presently at the rallies with Bernie Sanders and occasional Cortex have been to 9 or more rallies. So
Occasional
apparently,
critiques.
what we're seeing, yeah, I,
It took me a
uh,
second to figure out what you were talking about. I was like, what?
so apparently, what we're seeing here is a concerted effort at performative theatrics in which they're trying to show these very large rallies that are going against alleged oligarchy. Another funny use of that term. But again, as an historian, Tommy, there's nothing new here.
Right.
Brian Burrow wrote a book called Days of Rage, and I think you're almost as old as I am, and I was a child at the time. But from the late '60s through the early '70s, bombings were a daily occurrence in America. Radical
Yeah. Yeah.
bombings,
Weather
radical violence,
Underground. Yeah.
all of that. And of course, we can go back further in history, and we can find it before World War One, after World War One. That we've had mining protests and things like that. And then we fast forward to today. And I think what's going to happen, though, much to the chagrin of the paid activists, is blowing the lid off U.S. aid really took a lot of the wind out of the sails of the communist left
Mm.
planet wide. I think it's taken a lot of the push energy that made it what it was. The destruction of the DOE is a big step forward. It happens to be my conceit that if one were to zero out all government funding, K through PhD, in America, and I would hope the West, but we'll just look at America, that in a generation, communist as a rational ideology or one accepted by a lot of people would vanish.
Hmm. Yeah. I think we're finding out very slowly that what we thought were or what we have been told as grassroots movements around across the United States over the last 50, 60 years are actually astroturf and top-down movements, and that
Absolutely.
these, you know, and
Yeah.
that they're funded by NGOs that have been directly financed by USAID. That the Summer of Floyd was an attempt at a color revolution in the United States, which I've talked to Daniel McAdams about, and how much it looked like the revolutions of like Maidan, the attempted snow revolution in the Soviet Union, I mean, not Soviet Union, Russia in 2011. And how familiar it was. Daniel McAdams was actually in Maidan during 2014 during the revolution. I
When you
asked him,
spoke, go ahead.
I thought it was funny. I asked him, I was like, so, I mean, was it scary? He goes, no. He goes, it's like a bunch of rich liberals throwing a temper tantrum in the middle of the freaking street. It was ridiculous. We were at a restaurant down the road and they're firebombing a store, 3 blocks over. He's like,
It's just,
it was just ridiculous.
it is ridiculous. McAdams knows a lot about color revolutions. I plan
Mm,
on doing an episode on that. There's a fellow by the name of Norm Eisner. You've probably
hmm.
seen his
I know the name.
his
Yeah.
yeah, and he sort of wrote the book on color revolutions for the 21st century. He has been practicing lawfare since 2017 against the Trump administration and its adherents and things like that. And one can look at 2020 and to a certain extent say that had all the tell signs of a color revolution, and it
Hmm.
won. But I also think that if Trump had won a second term, then we would not be getting the bang for buck we're getting today,
Right.
because I think the 4 year exposure to Biden and his regime opened a lot of eyes to what's going on. And then when you take that 4 years and then all of a sudden you crack open USAID and you say, wow, we're starting to connect the dots.
Hmm.
Yeah.
I had heard some girl, I don't remember what her name was. She had worked as an intern in the first administration under Trump. She was like in her 20s at the time, and she said that they were starting already to get the scent of USAID, and that it was going to be a key function of his second term if he were to win in 2020 to actually begin like dismantling USAID. I don't know how true that is.
Yeah.
Obviously she
Yeah.
could just be trying to gain clout. I have no idea. But I talked to Pete Quinones a while back, and I told him, I said it was a huge mistake not allowing Trump the victory in 2020, because he had time to sit and develop a new strategy going forward and actually find other malcontents that he could then put in his new administration. They had effectively neutered Trump by continuously cycling the kind of like neo-reactionary, like, I mean, not neo-reaction, I guess neoliberal actors through his administration, and kind of kept him from being more in touch with his base and with the neo-reactionary movement that was actually developing under the surface. So I believe that they're going to look back, that 4 years with Biden in office is going to prove to be the catalyst that actually allows for some amount of success on Trump, from Trump's administration. I'm still waiting to see how that looks. I do find it interesting. I don't know. I'm probably not the only one that finds this interesting, but the amount of time that the people within the Trump administration are spending in the public eye, actually conversing with the public through long form podcasts and actually revealing what the strategy is. So I think they're having some success in fighting the media that's coming after him right now. It's still yet to be seen whether or not they're going to be successful.
We're all over the map in this conversation we're having, but I did want to touch on something that you just said, and that's when it comes to long form speaking, like what you and I are doing right now, having this conversation. And you and I may not be. I'm certain that you and I are 90% in agreement on a lot of things philosophically and morally. Otherwise, we probably wouldn't be colleagues at the institute. Nonetheless, there's probably things that I don't know that you have knowledge of, and that others do. What I find interesting with collectivist government supremacists and such, I don't know if it's laziness. I don't know if it's the fact that when you Socratically drill or ask, there's something Toyota does called Ono's five whys, where you ask why a problem is what it is. You're trying to get to the root of the problem. And there may
Mhm.
be proximate causes, but there's a root cause to that problem. I don't think government supremacists fare well under the kind of conversational dialogue you and I are having. For instance, imagine Trump goes on a 2 or 3 hour podcast along with Vance, with Rogan. He fares very well, which I
Mhm.
figured he would. What I find, and this is my conjecture, is I think that government supremacism is so morally, philosophically, and intellectually bankrupt, they cannot bear the cross examination, they cannot bear the questions, and they cannot answer them in a way that doesn't make them look like monsters.
So I think that's, yes, I think that you're correct in some form, but I think part of it is they've had so much control over the media apparatus since the 1960s,
Mm-hmm.
since the 1940s, probably with Operation Mockingbird. Just because the programmers were revealed doesn't mean they ended that program. It doesn't mean that the CIA is not involved with the talking points that you see on the media. And they thought they had a lock on the media, and that there were these parameters in which Fox would talk and CNN would talk, but they weren't going outside of those parameters. And with the development of podcasts, they don't have control over the talking points anymore. So they've never had to sit and defend their actual um, motives. And so they don't know how anymore. They've lost that ability. It's a muscle they
Yeah.
haven't
Yeah.
exercised in a long time.
So I'm going to give you that, but I'm also going to give you the fact that, and I have a certain, Peter Boghossian says it's very hard for us to get away from our side biases. You
Mm.
and I have side biases as members of the Institute, and the philosophy that we follow. It's hard for us to get out of that. But nonetheless, we have lived, you and I, as a minority for so long in the world that we are always questioned. We are always
Hmm.
interrogated. We are always asked to provide substantive reasons for the reason we think the way we do. Fortunately, we're individualist. And it's not hard for us not only to have a conjoining of intellectual and moral principles that sync up really well, but we're very good at argument, debate, discussion, examination, Socratic drilling, that kind of thing, where we can withstand it. But I happen to think, again, my side bias speaking, Tommy,
Hmm.
is that communists don't have it. Communists have to resort to violence and gulags and murder and killing and show trials and stuff like that because you can't talk somebody into that because it's like they say you can vote yourself into socialism, but you can only shoot your way out.
Hmm. Well, and that was something that Tucker Carlson had mentioned a while back was that had Kamala Harris won, that you were going to be looking at a situation where podcasters were going to be locked up because they couldn't control the narrative and they have to
Right?
control the narrative.
They have to. Yeah.
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 Yeah. And that's why there's such a push for censorship on the internet. And you see this a lot in Britain, where they're locking people up for, just silly jokes,
For being
memes.
British, for being
Right.
white British people. Yeah.
Right. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
And so I think do you think how important is it that podcasters talk about the different things that are going on in Europe and in Britain? I tend to ignore them because I'm American. I really don't care what they're doing over there. Like they can all kill
Yeah.
themselves, and I'm like, all right, whatever, man. Like if that's what y'all want to do, go. Okay, it's not
Well,
my problem.
you're talking to the right guy because I like to listen to podcasts when I'm working or doing my hobbies, things like that. So I do happen to listen to several podcasts from over there, like Andrew Gold
Mm,
does Heretics, which is really good. Winston Marshall, and yes, he was a member of that band that I'm not familiar with, but he's a conservative pundit there, and he brings on very interesting folks. And then I listen to the podcast of the Lotus Eaters. So
mm.
there's three English centric podcasts that I do frequent, and I've got my finger on the pulse of what's going on there. I think if they can't stop what's going on, Britain, which I consider to be a third world country with one teetering first world city in London, is going to be a caliphate adjacent country in a generation.
Mm. Yeah, and honestly, my mother-in-law lives in Britain. I should
Okay.
probably pay more attention to it. I just,
Yeah.
I find it hard to have time to pay attention to everything too. I drive a truck, and I'll get some listening done during the day, but for the most part, I'm really busy 4 days a week. I don't get home until really late at night, and then my 3 days off, I'm usually podcasting or fishing, maybe doing some yard work. That's
Yeah.
kind of the
Yeah.
that's kind of the way I live my life. And so between church and work and then podcasting, I don't really have a lot of time to pay attention to everything else that's going on.
Sure. Sure.
So but you did bring up the fact that you are Afrikaner. My wife
Yeah.
is a Buddha. She's
Oh,
from
okay.
she's from
So
Pretoria.
she's from South Africa.
Yes, yes.
Alsjeblieft.
Yeah, I actually just got back. I had gone to Namibia because that's where her father's from. He's
Okay.
from Namibia.
Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
flew over there last summer and spent some time with him. I keep
So you're
saying,
so you're knee deep in what I was just talking about when I was talking about what's happening, this virtual genocide against the Boers
the
that's happening
Afrikaner,
there.
yes.
This is nothing new to you.
Right. Yeah. It's
Yeah. I
something I've
mean,
been, and that's why I brought up South Africa earlier because
yeah.
it's a history I look into. I'm very
Yeah.
interested.
Yeah.
And uh, and my wife wants to move back there. She wants to move to Cape Town in a few years. That's kind of the
No, make sure
goal.
you move to Orania if you go anywhere.
I would love to. That would be awesome. But
Yes.
she loves Cape
Yes.
Town. She loves Cape
Has she
Town.
been there lately?
Yeah. Well, we haven't been to Cape Town in years.
That
We're
is
going,
that
I
is
think we're going to go visit. We're supposed to go visit in a couple of years. So we're putting together plans to head
I
down
hope
there
you
and
could be
visit.
armed when you're there.
Yeah, I wish I
Yeah.
could.
Yeah. Yeah.
But unfortunately, that's not the way it works. But um but that so that so I do pay attention to what's going on in South Africa. It's one of those things that I've always found interesting ever since I met her, the history of South Africa. Um and I I I I feel like I always say that if you want to see where America is going to be in like 10, 15 years, look at South Africa. I mean,
Interesting. Okay.
that's the trajectory that I
That's
find
very frightening.
America. That's the trajectory I find America to be on. Maybe the Trump administration is able to, slow some of that. Especially with Elon Musk being South African, having
Yeah.
roots in South Africa, he can kind of see the path that America's on
Yeah.
as a parallel path. Especially when they started tearing down statues and stuff like that, I was like, "That's wild." Like, what are y'all doing?
I'm not
Um,
surprised.
do you think that there is an opportunity. As much as I have issues with the Trump administration, I feel like it's such a better shot of saving like kind of our way of life is utilizing the people within his administration, especially when you look at like JD Vance moving forward. How do you look at these people and kind of their vision of what America is?
So I know that government is always imperfect. Of course it is. It's the
Mm,
state. It's why you and I are in the position we're in as being opposed to practically everything that they are. I mean, when somebody asks me what is my philosophical position, I always say I'm an abolitionist. I don't say I'm an anarchist because that is weighted and freighted with a lot of tautologies and definitions that people don't understand.
mm,
But I say I'm an abolitionist because I'm opposed to all forms of human slavery, to include chattel, to include taxation, to
mm,
include regulation, and that kind of thing. So for me, and that's more of an ideation, Tommy, for me to do because I can't have that in this world. But if I shoot for the moon and I get less than the moon, I'll do better than shooting for simply lesser government. I have two books on Amazon, and one of them is called ZeroGov. ZeroGov is the website that I shuttered just temporarily in 2020, and I'd been running it ever since I got excommunicated from Lou Rockwell. And what happened is the book's subtitle is Unicorns and Limited Government and Other Mythological Creatures. So that and the reason why I'm giving you this preamble to answer your question is to tell you where I'm coming from with this.
mm,
I was so concerned that with another continuation of the DNC CPUSA for another 4 years would ruin the children, ruin the world for my children and grandchildren, that
mm,
their future would be forfeit in this
right.
country. We have a chance now. And I do see in J.D. Vance a Pat Buchanan style paleo conservatism, along with a reluctance to go to war, which I
Hmm.
always champion, and a reluctance to get involved in treaty obligations like NATO. I just issued part two to my Get Out of NATO series that I've done. That was part of Fixing Fight Club. And I would have never, I would, you couldn't have told me, Tommy, in November before we were assured that a new administration was coming in, that
Hmm.
number one, we would have the guy in office again who was the first adult in my lifetime who didn't get us into a new war, whatever you
Hmm.
think of Trump, didn't do
Right.
it during his administration. Number two, Doge comes and cracks open these agencies. And for the first time, and you alluded to this earlier, we're seeing how all of this performative theatrics and, frankly, an iron hand and a velvet glove. Who's paying for that? It's you and I. You and I are paying for our manacles and our chains and our plantations and things
Hmm.
like that. He's revealing that. So I have hope. Um, it was Trump who got us halfway to zero for the corporate income tax, which I think is where it should be. I'll take 38% to 21. I think that's what it was. I think the corporate income tax should be zero. I'm opposed to all taxes,
Hmm.
and I find that I have hope. I do have hope.
I feel like so one of the things I saw that I don't know. I don't know how I feel about everything that's going on. Um, because of the way the media is framing everything. I'm not sure that we're on a trajectory that can be sustained with the narrative the way it is. But because I remember seeing that story of the EPA slush fund that was going to the Podestas and then being funneled out to like Stacey Abrams and all these Democratic operatives, and I'm like, okay, so they're taking tax dollars, funneling it through NGOs that were just started like a month ago, like, and then they're dumping it into to
Yeah,
Democratic operatives
yeah.
to run for office. Like, how is this not a story? And nobody's talking about it. Like
I
I pay attention to like
yeah.
some of the mainstream like kind of because like Glenn Beck or Megyn Kelly, I'll pay attention to some of them to find out what average people are listening to. They're not talking about this stuff. And it's like, why aren't you talking about it?
I think Beck's talking about it. I do.
I
I've
haven't
seen him
heard him
talking
say
about it,
anything,
and
but
I think Rogan's certainly talking about it. And nobody has a bigger audience than Rogan
true.
in this particular sphere. And I mentioned to you, there you have Andrew Gold with Heretics, which is a great program.
Mhm.
I used to listen to Constantine with trigonometry, but I got so turned off by his attacks on Darrow Cooper, who I hold in the highest regard as a fellow historian. I mean,
Mm,
I barely hold a candle to Darrow Cooper and Martyr
mm,
Maid and what he does. I'm a big fan of his work, but I love the way he's taking the World War II narrative and just tossing it into the dumpster where it
mm,
belongs. And because historical revisionism is necessarily a reframing for better understanding. And some people have abused that. Some people have used that. Pat Buchanan, for instance, wrote a book back in the day, as you'll probably recall, where I think the title was The Unnecessary War about World War
mm,
II. I happen to feel the same way. I mean, one riddle that I quipped on my latest podcast was that I'm a time cop, Tommy, and you're my captain, and you send me back in time to murder baby Hitler, and I come back to report to you, and I say, hey, I didn't murder baby Hitler, but I did assassinate Woodrow Wilson, and you respond by saying Adolf who? So
mm,
when it comes to historical revisionism, it's not simply a refashioning for a narrative, it's digging around through all the footnotes, the primary source documentation, the secondary source documentation, and all of those things to arrive at a phrase that I'm very fond of that you can steal if you wish, called the single most accurate picture, where I take my bias filter, I take your bias filter, or I take the bias filter of all these books that I've read here in my den, and I try to arrive at a rational conclusion that may very well be not what the received wisdom is among historians. For instance, there you have Darrell Cooper and Martyr Maid, where he, and I think he was being hyperbolic when he said this, but he's with Tucker Carlson, and he says that Churchill was the chief villain. He uses the article the.
mhm,
He should have said Churchill was a chief villain. Later on, Darrell may have misspoke, or he may have been doing that just to hype things up. I happen to agree that there were no good guys for the most part in the political ranks during that entire conflict. For instance, I mean, there you have Churchill, not the PM yet in September 1939, urging the PM at the time in the UK to declare war on Germany when it meets Russia halfway across Poland, but they don't declare war on the Russians. So he's Churchill through the hand puppet of the PM at the time, because Churchill doesn't become PM, I think, until April, May 1940. They've declared war as a result of that German invasion into Poland. Don't declare war on Russia. And in 44 and 45, as a result of talks with Stalin, he gives Poland and all the Eastern European countries to the communists.
mhm.
What? What? So, and of course, that has to be spun in a fashion in the triumphalist narrative of the West where, well, that's what had to be done. Well, those were articles of necessity, and those were things that just had to happen to make the world safe for they don't say what I'm about to say. It made the world safe for communism because
Hmm.
what it did is it ensured that a third running on half the planet until 1991 was under communist domination as a result of that alliance. Now, for me, when I am asked, well, what would you have done if you were king or god for a day? Is the Germans? Isn't it? By the way, another preamble, another just observation here. We always call them Nazis, right? Why don't we
Hmm.
say then that the Tories were fighting from Great Britain and that the Democrats were fighting from the U.S. But we always use Nazi to describe the Germans when they're in the fight. We never use communist to mark up the Russians when they're in this fight. But if you had had the Germans and the Russians, summer of 1941 with Operation Barbarossa, where Germany invades Russia, let them fight. Let
Hmm.
them fight. How could the world be worse for each of them tearing each other to shreds? And then we come up and we just pick up after the mess. The world, this is a counterfactual, may have been a better place because it certainly wasn't a better place after what happened.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's funny that it's the last moral war that was fought.
Yeah.
Like that's one of those you're not supposed to cross that Rubicon and ask, like, did we really have to be involved in that?
Yeah.
Like it's an automatic knee-jerk reaction is yes, kind of like when you ask about did the Civil War really have to be fought? Like the knee-jerk reaction is yes, you had to end slavery.
You and I could
Okay,
talk for hours.
right. and, and
Yeah.
so and so you're like, sure, okay, yeah, I agree. You had to end slavery, but is that how you had to end it? Was that necessary to
I
end
know.
slavery?
I know.
And nobody
Yep.
wants to have that conversation. If you
Yeah.
ask that question, then obviously you're a racist and you're a bigot. And it's
Of
like,
course.
no,
Of
I just
course.
want to know, like, is there any other way to handle
Yeah.
conflict?
Yeah.
Like, and so,
I
but
hate to
but yeah,
ask
so
Tommy,
destroying the religiosity.
I hate to ask this, but do you edit this? I'm asking this during the time we're recording.
No, I don't. I don't
Oh,
edit.
you
I
don't?
usually
Okay.
just put it out. I want people to see all my
Yeah.
hiccups and how
Because
bad I am at
I've
what
got
I'm
to go
doing.
in 2 minutes for another
Okay,
meeting.
yeah, no.
And I'm
Well,
so
let's
sorry. I
no,
should
no,
have
you're
told you before.
fine.
Yeah.
Plug all your stuff so people know where to find you and we'll let you go.
Okay, so I am the Smedley D. Butler Fellow for Military Affairs at the Libertarian Institute, along with my colleague Tommy, and I run Chasing Ghost, an irregular warfare podcast, and War Notes, a conflict podcast. And you could find that on your favorite podcast vendor. And happy to hear from folks who have questions, recommendations, or gentlemanly riposte or disagreements with me.
All right.
Thanks.
Yeah, no, this was fun, man. Yeah, go check out his podcast, Chasing Ghosts. It's really informative. It's really interesting. I just finished the series on the Mexican cartels, so that one was really good. So, all right, we'll stop the recording right here.